Alex had always lived a simple life, with everything in its place. But one evening, as they walked home through the quiet streets, something felt wrong. Their shadow did not move like it used to. It moved differently, as if it had a mind of its own. At first, it was subtle, a quick flicker in the corner of their eye. But as days passed, the shadow started acting more strangely. It seemed to follow Alex's every move, yet not in the way it should. Something was wrong. Something was watching, waiting. Could their own shadow be alive? And if so, why? Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. Alex had always lived with a sense of control over their life. Their job was stable, their apartment organized, and their social circle small but tight. Everything appeared perfectly in order, at least on the surface. The kind of person who made lists and followed routines, Alex was known for their composure and calm. The outside world saw them as someone who had it all together, someone who never lost control, someone who had a method for everything. But, deep within, there was always something lingering just beneath the surface, an uncomfortable feeling that never fully went away. It was the nagging sensation that something was missing, something more significant that they couldn't put their finger on. They had never been able to shake the feeling that there was more to life than the perfect routine they had built. But that was okay, right? Everyone felt that way sometimes, didn't they? Perhaps it was just the pressure of being a successful professional in a demanding city, or the loneliness that sometimes crept in after a long day of work. Whatever it was, Alex simply brushed it off, telling themselves that everyone had their moments of doubt. On a particular evening, however, things took an unsettling turn. It wasn't a dramatic event, nor was there an immediate cause for alarm. It was just a regular night. Alex finished work, left the office, and walked home through the streets they knew so well. The air was cold, with a faint chill that suggested rain would soon follow, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Their footsteps echoed against the pavement as they walked, the familiar rhythm of their shoes hitting the ground grounding them into their routine. As Alex turned the corner near their apartment building, something strange caught their eye. Their shadow, stretched long and dark on the pavement, did not move quite as they did. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. At first, Alex thought nothing of it, brushing it off as a trick of the light or perhaps the fatigue from the long day. But as they continued down the street, they couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was different. The shadow, though it followed them, didn't move in sync with them. It lagged behind by a fraction of a second, like a delayed reflection. It felt wrong. Alex paused for a moment, standing still to watch the shadow. It flickered slightly, as if adjusting to the dim streetlight, but it didn't match their movements as it had always done before. There was an unnatural hesitation. The shadow wasn't following in the way it should, as if it was waiting for something. Alex blinked and shook their head. Maybe they were simply tired. It was a long day. Maybe it was nothing at all. They shrugged it off, continuing their walk. But the strange occurrence didn't stop there. The following day, when Alex got home from work and entered their apartment, they glanced down at the floor. The shadow stretched across the floor, but it didn't move in the way it should. It seemed to stand still for a brief moment longer than usual, almost as if it had its own mind, or worse, that it was waiting for something. Alex stopped in their tracks and stared at it. The room suddenly felt colder. Alex looked around, trying to find a logical explanation. But there was no source for this feeling. No open window, no drafts. Just a deep, chilling sense that something was wrong. Something that couldn't be explained. Something that felt too real to ignore. For the next few days, the shadow's behavior continued to grow more strange. It began to move on its own. When Alex entered a room, the shadow stayed behind for a split second before catching up. It was no longer mimicking their movements exactly. It started to stretch in unusual ways, as though it was trying to push itself beyond its usual boundaries. The dark shape seemed to take on a life of its own. It didn't simply follow, they felt its presence. It felt as though it was watching them, waiting. The strangest thing happened one evening as Alex sat on the couch, watching television. They looked over at their shadow on the wall. This time, the shadow was not simply an extension of their own form. It was twisting and stretching in a way that was too contorted to be natural. As they sat frozen in place, the shadow on the wall continued to shift in ways they couldn't understand, moving as though it were separate from them entirely. It seemed to pulse, elongate, and contract unnaturally. The more Alex tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow, becoming more alive, more aware. In a state of growing panic, Alex stood up quickly, moving towards the light switch. As they did, the shadow did not follow immediately. It stayed there on the wall, unmoving for a second, before it stretched further into the corner of the room. Alex's heart began to race. This was not normal. Shadows didn't act like this. They were just shadows. They were supposed to reflect what you did. But this shadow wasn't simply reflecting. It was becoming something else. Something that felt like it was controlling them. Alex was no longer sure if the shadow was simply following them, or if it was now an entity that had its own purpose. In the days that followed, the shadow began to show more signs of life. It grew darker at times, flickering in the corners of Alex's vision. It seemed to react to Alex's emotions. Whenever Alex was feeling sad, the shadow would stretch ominously across the walls, and when they were angry, it would twist in unnatural shapes, as though mocking their frustration. The more Alex tried to regain control, the more the shadow pushed back, each movement seeming to challenge Alex's own sense of reality. Alex became increasingly paranoid. They would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of their eye, only to turn quickly and find nothing there. The shadow was never in the same place as before. It was everywhere, lurking behind them when they turned corners, standing still in mirrors when they weren't looking, and sometimes, when Alex was alone, it felt like the shadow was standing beside them, looking over their shoulder. Alex no longer felt as if they were walking alone. One evening, Alex sat in front of the mirror, looking at their reflection. The shadow behind them was perfectly still. For the first time in days, Alex felt a fleeting sense of peace. But when they turned to look directly at it, the shadow moved. Slowly, it stretched, and then it flickered like a bad signal on a television screen. Alex stood frozen, their pulse quickening as they watched in terror. For a brief second, the shadow did not mirror their movements. It stayed still as Alex turned, but it remained in the same place. It was waiting. This time, Alex didn't try to explain it away. They felt the terror creeping up their spine, the realization that this was no accident. The shadow wasn't just reflecting their movements, it was controlling them. There was something wrong, something that could no longer be ignored. The questions began to form in Alex's mind, though they didn't want to admit them. Was it possible that their shadow was alive? Was it some sort of external force that had taken hold of them? Or was it simply a reflection of the darkest parts of their own mind? As the days went by, Alex began to notice that the shadow's strange behavior was growing more pronounced. It was no longer just a subtle flicker or a slight delay in its movement. This was something more disturbing, something they couldn't quite ignore anymore. The shadow seemed to be evolving, becoming something darker, more active, as if it had its own will, its own motives. Alex tried to convince themselves that it was just stress, that maybe they were working too hard or hadn't been getting enough sleep. But no amount of sleep or rest seemed to ease the creeping unease. Every time Alex walked into a room, the shadow seemed to follow them more aggressively. The movement was no longer in sync with their own, it was out of step, always a second behind, but always present in a way that felt invasive. It was as if it was taking its time to analyze them, to watch them with an intensity that Alex couldn't escape. One afternoon, Alex decided to take a walk to clear their head. They left their apartment and walked down the familiar streets of the city, trying to shake off the feeling that their own reflection was stalking them. As they strolled through the park, they noticed the shadow again, stretched out on the ground ahead of them. But something was different this time. The shadow didn't stretch in a uniform way, like it usually did. Instead, it twisted and contorted, elongating in odd shapes that made Alex pause in their tracks. The shadow appeared to bend, moving in ways that Alex couldn't replicate. It shifted as if it were trying to break free of the limitations of the ground it was cast upon. As Alex stopped walking, the shadow stopped too, but it didn't stay in its usual shape. It shifted, as if acknowledging their presence, as if it was doing this for its own amusement. It wasn't following Alex's movements, it was anticipating them. The horror of it all set in as Alex realized that this wasn't just a trick of the light. It was more than a reflection. The shadow wasn't simply mimicking their movements anymore, it was becoming independent. It was becoming something else entirely. That evening, Alex went home, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that settled deeper with each passing moment. They made dinner and went about their usual routine, but the feeling of being watched never left them. The shadow had become a constant companion, lurking in the background, shifting in ways that seemed deliberate. It was no longer merely following, it was reacting. As Alex sat down to eat, they caught a glimpse of the shadow on the wall again. This time, it seemed to elongate unnaturally, stretching out as though it was reaching toward them. Alex froze, eyes locked on the dark figure that loomed against the pale light. The longer they stared, the more they felt that the shadow was reaching for them, not physically, but with some other kind of presence. It was as if it was beckoning them to acknowledge it, to confront it. The next morning, Alex's unease reached a breaking point. They woke up to find that the shadow had not only been present in their room while they slept, but it seemed to have changed shape during the night. The edges were no longer crisp, they had become blurred, as though the shadow was actively distorting itself. It was as though the shadow was warping, twisting to take on a more sinister form. Panicked, Alex rushed to the mirror, thinking that perhaps their reflection would offer some sense of normality. But as they gazed into the glass, the shadow in the reflection did not match their own. It wasn't simply darker, it had taken on an entirely new shape. It stood still while Alex's reflection moved, and then, as Alex turned their head, the shadow followed too soon, ahead of their movements, almost as if anticipating the next motion. It was now leading them. Alex couldn't understand it. They stepped back from the mirror, feeling as though they were losing their grip on reality. Was this shadow alive? Was it merely a reflection of some deep, internal fear manifesting itself, or was something darker, something supernatural at play? The next few days were filled with an overwhelming sense of paranoia. Alex tried to act normal, to go through their daily routine as usual, but every time they walked past a reflective surface, whether it was a window, a mirror, or even a puddle, the shadow was there, always a fraction of a second ahead of them, always waiting. It wasn't mimicking Alex's movements anymore. It was acting with intent, as if it was learning, adapting to Alex's every step. Alex tried to confront it one evening. They stood in front of the mirror, watching the shadow stretch across the floor, and tried to force themselves to stay calm. With all their strength, they took a step forward, determined to face it head-on. The shadow flickered, momentarily distorting, but it didn't remain static. Instead, it moved with them, but faster, quicker than their own steps, as if mocking them. The reflection didn't look like Alex anymore, it looked distorted, broken. In a moment of panic, Alex reached out, attempting to touch the glass. But before they could, the shadow stretched out of the mirror. Alex stumbled back, heart racing in terror, as the shadow moved away from the mirror and toward them. Their breath caught in their throat as the shadow seemed to loom larger, darker. It wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was something else. It was like an extension of themselves, but at the same time, something completely alien and terrifying. This moment marked the beginning of Alex's full descent into confusion and terror. The realization hit them with full force. Their shadow was no longer just a physical phenomenon. It had become a presence in their life, a dark force that no longer obeyed their movements, that no longer mimicked them in the way it should. It was leading, controlling, haunting. The worst part, Alex realized, with growing dread, that the shadow might be waiting for something else. Something more than just their acknowledgement. Was it trying to show them something? Or was it trying to consume them? The line between the shadow and their own mind was beginning to blur, and Alex could feel their grip on reality slipping away. The nights had become unbearable. Each time Alex closed their eyes, the shadows lingered, haunting their every thought. They had stopped sleeping in their bed altogether, instead opting to sleep on the couch, surrounded by lights, desperately trying to ward off whatever darkness was creeping into their life. But no matter where they were, no matter how many lights they turned on, the shadow always found a way to creep into their mind. Alex tried to rationalize it, telling themselves it was all in their head. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. Their shadow wasn't just a reflection anymore, It had become something separate, something with its own agenda. It followed them, it watched them, and sometimes it seemed to move of its own accord, like it was waiting for Alex to do something, or maybe for them to stop doing something. One night, Alex couldn't take it anymore. They had spent hours pacing around their apartment, trying to understand what was happening to them, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. The shadows, once subtle, had become more aggressive, more forceful. The moment Alex stood still, they could feel the weight of the shadow pressing in on them. It wasn't just the flickering of light anymore, it was as though the shadow was becoming a physical presence, something that threatened to consume them. In a fit of frustration, Alex decided to confront it once and for all. They stood in front of the mirror, staring at their reflection, determined to face the fear that had consumed them. But as they gazed at the shadow behind them, something strange happened. The shadow didn't behave the way it had before. It didn't move with Alex's movements. It twisted. It contorted. It stretched in unnatural ways, as if it were reaching out for something. Alex felt their heart race in terror as they watched the shadow shift, taking on a form that was no longer their own. The shadow started to move independently, crawling up the walls, stretching in ways that defied the laws of nature. It seemed to reach for Alex, as though trying to pull them into its darkness. For a moment, Alex wondered if they were dreaming, if their mind had finally snapped under the pressure. But no, this was real. The shadow was real. The worst part was that Alex didn't feel like they were in control anymore. They had always believed that shadows were simply the product of light and darkness, an unavoidable result of light sources cast upon their form. But now, the shadow seemed to have a mind of its own. It was no longer just a byproduct of Alex's movements. It was acting with intent. "Why are you doing this?" Alex whispered, but the shadow didn't respond. Instead, it stretched, elongating itself further, its edges becoming blurry as if it were reaching beyond the confines of the physical world. It no longer looked like Alex's reflection, it looked like something else, something sinister and dark. Alex tried to step away from the mirror, but the shadow followed. It wasn't just following anymore, it was leading, guiding them to the darkest corners of their mind. Alex's pulse quickened. This was no longer just an annoyance or a strange phenomenon, it was an invasion. The shadow wasn't just attached to them, it was trying to possess them. It was pulling them towards something, something they couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, the shadow moved faster than Alex could react. In a terrifying blur, it rushed toward them, wrapping around their feet like a dark tendril. It seemed to pull Alex down, pulling them to the floor. Alex stumbled, but the shadow remained. It coiled around them, seeping into their skin. Panic set in as Alex tried to free themselves, but the shadow only tightened its grip. It felt as though it was crawling beneath their skin, spreading into their body, filling them with an unnatural coldness. Their breath became shallow, and their mind began to spiral. They were no longer in control. "What do you want from me?" Alex screamed, but there was no answer, just the suffocating weight of the shadow that seemed to whisper in the depths of their mind. The terror was indescribable, like a constant pressure, a darkness that was slowly overtaking them. The shadow twisted around Alex's body, pushing them into a dark corner of their apartment. It was as if it had completely taken over. They couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every part of them felt consumed, as though their very essence was being absorbed by this creature, this presence. The shadow's influence had spread from their reflection to their physical body. It wasn't just watching anymore, it was trying to become them. In their final moments of sanity, Alex realized the horrible truth. The shadow wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't an external force at all. It was inside them. It was an embodiment of everything they had repressed, everything they had feared, every regret, every guilt. It was their darkest self coming to life, the version of themselves they had tried so hard to ignore. The shadow wasn't trying to haunt them, it was trying to make them face everything they had been running from. With this realization came a new kind of terror. The shadow was no longer just something external. It had always been there, lurking in the depths of Alex's mind. It had been there when they made mistakes, when they failed, when they refused to confront the darker parts of themselves. It wasn't a monster. It was them. As Alex stood paralyzed by fear, They understood that the only way to escape the shadow was to confront the very thing it represented, everything they had buried deep within themselves. But how could they face such darkness? How could they confront the very core of their fear and guilt? The shadow continued to tighten its grip, but Alex knew deep down that it wouldn't stop until they accepted it. Until they acknowledged what they had tried so desperately to hide. The room was suffocating. The darkness that filled the apartment felt unnatural, thick like a physical weight pressing down on Alex's chest. For the past few days, they had felt utterly trapped, both by the shadow and by the growing sense of dread that followed them everywhere. No matter how many lights they turned on, no matter how many mirrors they avoided, the shadow was always there, waiting, lurking, following. It had invaded every part of their life, even their thoughts. It was no longer a mere presence. It was a haunting that consumed them, drawing them closer to the edge of sanity. Alex sat alone on the couch, their eyes red from lack of sleep, staring into the dark corners of their apartment. The shadow had become more than just a distorted figure in the mirror, it had woven itself into their very existence. They could no longer tell where they ended and the shadow began. It had been a slow process, a gradual descent into terror, but now Alex was certain of one thing: they could not escape. It wasn't just outside of them anymore. It was within them, controlling their every movement, every thought, every breath. The terror of facing the shadow's truth had nearly broken them. It was as if the shadow was an extension of themselves, the part of them that they had kept hidden, repressed, for so long. Alex had tried everything. They had turned to meditation, to hypnosis, to every self-help technique they could find. Nothing worked. The shadow was too powerful. It resisted every effort to break free, every attempt to regain control. But now, there was no escaping it. There was no running from the darkness that had consumed them. The more they struggled, the more the shadow grew stronger, feeding off their fear. It had taken root in their mind, in their soul, and Alex realized that there was only one way out. There was only one way to rid themselves of the shadow's grip. They had to confront it, face it head-on, and accept the darkness that it represented. The decision was terrifying, but Alex had no choice. They could not live this way anymore. The constant anxiety, the never-ending sense of dread, the feeling of being watched, it had to end. They had tried everything to escape, but now they understood the truth. The shadow was a reflection of their own inner turmoil, their repressed guilt, their unresolved fears. The only way to rid themselves of it was to face the very things they had been running from for so long. Alex stood up, shaking, but determined. They walked to the mirror, the one that had once reflected their own fearful face, the one that had shown them the twisted, dark shape of their shadow. They looked at themselves for a long time, waiting for the shadow to appear, for the darkness to take shape in the reflection. But this time, Alex wasn't afraid. This time, they knew that they had to face it. The moment they stepped closer to the mirror, the shadow appeared, stretching and contorting as it always had. But instead of recoiling in fear, Alex stepped forward, placing their hand on the glass. The shadow rippled, but it didn't pull away. It seemed to recognize something in Alex, something they had never seen before, a quiet strength, a resolve. The shadow's form seemed to grow darker, as if it was trying to swallow Alex whole. The feeling of being consumed, of being overwhelmed by the darkness, was overwhelming. But Alex stood their ground. "I see you," they whispered, their voice trembling but strong. "I know what you are. You are not my enemy. You are me." The shadow wavered, flickering as if it were trying to resist. But Alex held steady, forcing themselves to face the darkness in front of them. It wasn't just a physical shadow anymore. It was a manifestation of all the pain, all the regret, all the anger that Alex had buried inside for so long. They had spent their entire life running from their own demons, trying to outrun the things that scared them the most. But now, they had to face them. The shadow grew larger, threatening to overtake Alex, but they didn't back down. "I accept you," they said, their voice gaining strength with each word. "I accept everything you represent. I will not run from you anymore. I am not afraid of you." The room seemed to go still. The shadow did not shrink, but neither did it consume Alex. It seemed to pause, as if uncertain, as if it were waiting for Alex to make the final decision. Alex could feel it, the overwhelming force of all their unresolved emotions, their darkest fears, all bearing down on them. But for the first time, instead of fighting, instead of running, they allowed themselves to feel it all. The fear, the guilt, the shame, they let it flood them. And in doing so, something strange happened. The shadow seemed to lose its power. It no longer felt like a separate entity, something dark and foreign. It was part of them, part of their own soul. And as Alex stood there, allowing the shadow to exist alongside them, they realized that they no longer feared it. They had accepted it. The darkness began to fade, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer a threat. Alex had stopped fighting it, and in doing so, they had taken back control of their own mind. The shadow was no longer something that could control them. It was part of them, but it didn't define them. Alex stepped back from the mirror, breathing deeply. The air in the room felt different, lighter, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from their shoulders. For the first time in weeks, they felt a sense of calm. They could still feel the presence of the shadow, but it was no longer a threat. It was no longer something that haunted them. They smiled, a small, uncertain smile, but it was real. Alex had faced their darkest fears, their most repressed emotions, and they had come out on the other side stronger. The shadow was still there, but now it was just a part of them. No longer a monster, no longer a terrifying force. Just a shadow. And shadows, Alex realized, only exist because there is light. The stillness in Alex's apartment was almost deafening. The battle, the confrontation, was over. The shadow no longer dominated their thoughts or actions. It had become a part of them, no longer something to fear but something to understand. Alex could finally breathe again, the weight of the previous weeks lifting as though the very air around them had changed. It was as if the darkness that had consumed their life for so long had been integrated, accepted, and now it no longer held any power over them. Standing in the quiet of the apartment, Alex realized something profound. 4 years, they had tried to outrun their own inner demons. They had buried their guilt, their fears, their anger, and all the unresolved emotions that came with them. But in facing the shadow, by accepting it as a part of themselves, they had broken free. The shadow had no power over them now, not because they had destroyed it, but because they had embraced it. Alex walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to peek out at the city below. The once familiar lights of the street were now less daunting. The city that had always seemed so cold and indifferent suddenly felt welcoming, almost like a new beginning. There was no longer the oppressive weight of fear hanging over them. It was as if the shadow had released its hold on their heart, and in doing so, Alex had gained a new sense of clarity. But even though the battle with the shadow was over, Alex knew the journey wasn't complete. Accepting the darkness within wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The shadow had taught them a valuable lesson. The things we fear the most are often the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. But when we allow ourselves to face those parts, to accept them, we are not just freed from fear, we are freed to grow. Alex took a deep breath and let the air fill their lungs. They were no longer afraid of the shadow. No longer afraid of the parts of themselves they had tried so hard to hide. Instead of running, they had embraced them. And in doing so, they had reclaimed their life, their peace. The next morning, Alex went for a walk outside. They had not done this in a long time. The sun was warm, and for the first time in ages, they felt a sense of freedom they hadn't experienced before. As they walked through the streets, Alex realized how much they had changed. The world hadn't changed, not really. But they had. The weight of the shadow had been lifted, not because it had disappeared, but because Alex had allowed themselves to coexist with it. They were no longer a prisoner to the darkness. Instead, they had learned to live with it, to walk alongside it without letting it control them. As Alex made their way down the street, they noticed the reflection of themselves in the windows of the stores they passed. For the first time in a long time, the reflection didn't seem strange. The shadow that once haunted them was now a mere shadow, just a part of their being. They smiled at their reflection, not because they had defeated the shadow, but because they had learned to accept it. They had learned to accept themselves. But the journey didn't end here. There was still more to learn, more to explore within themselves. Alex realized that confronting the shadow had given them a new understanding of their own mind. It had freed them, but it had also opened a door to a new kind of growth. There would always be shadows, both inside and out, but now Alex knew how to face them, how to walk through life with them, not against them. As Alex continued down the street, they passed a small park and noticed a group of children playing. For a moment, they stopped and watched them, smiling. The carefree laughter of the children echoed through the park, and for the first time in ages, Alex felt a sense of peace wash over them. They no longer felt like they were walking alone in the dark. They had found a new sense of balance, a new way of living with both light and shadow. The shadow that had once terrified them was now a part of who they were. It was no longer something to fear, but something to understand, something that had taught them how to be whole. And as they continued their walk, Alex couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude for the shadow that had once haunted them. It had been their greatest challenge, but it had also been their greatest teacher. The world around them felt different, lighter, as if the heavy clouds that had once loomed over them had dissipated. Alex had learned that to truly live, they had to accept both the light and the shadow. The darkness wasn't something to destroy. It was something to embrace, to walk alongside, knowing that it was a part of the human experience. The journey of self-discovery had just begun. But the next step was clear. The shadow was no longer a threat, it was simply a reminder of the strength that came from accepting all parts of oneself.